It's an enormous pleasure to be here. My old friend, I won't say how old, but as ever grateful for his love and friendship. Reverend Hall invited me for this morning, and I want to thank him for inviting me. Um, so there's a story about some porters working for a famous rabbi of the 3rd century named Rabba Bar Hanan, and they broke a jug of the wine that they were carrying for him. He seized their clothes to pay for the damages, and the porters went to another great sage known as Rav. And Rav said to Rabba Bar Hanan, "Give them their clothing back." Rabba Bar Hanan said to him, "Is this the law?" Rav said, "Yes, because of the principle stated in Proverbs 2:20, you should walk in the ways of the good." So he gave them back their clothes. And they said to him, "We're poor, and we troubled ourselves to work all day, and we're needy. Do we receive nothing?" And immediately Rav said to Rabba Bar Hanan, "Go and give them their wages." He said to Rav, "Is this the law?" And Rav said, "Yes," and completed the quote of Proverbs 2:20, "You should keep the ways of the righteous." You may have read one of the many articles that have been recently published about quiet quitting. Quiet quitting is when an employee declines to do work which is not part of their contractual obligation. For example, if you're paid hourly and your hours are 9 to 5, and your supervisor gives you more work than can be done in that time and expects you to stay beyond that time to complete it, but you don't stay past 5 p.m. It's important to notice that the framing of this idea as a form of quitting rather than as actually just doing the job that you're hired to do. It seems to have become a societal norm that in the US, most workers are expected to do significantly more than they're actually paid for. In the portion of scripture, the Torah portion, that the Jewish community reads this week, the Hebrew scriptures raise directly the matter of wages and remind us that wages are not a luxury, and that each employer is obligated to pay honest wages to their workers in a timely and a fair way. Deuteronomy 24:15 says, "Be'amo titen scharo v'lo tavo alav hashemesh, ki onihu, ve'elav hu noseh et nafsho, v'lo yikra alecha el Adonai v'haya b'chachet." You must pay out any wages due on the same day before the sun sets. For the worker is needy, and his life depends upon it. Else a cry to God will be issued against you, and you will be held responsible by God. The Torah sees a significant imbalance of power between the worker and the employer, with the power being on the side of the employer. In order to redress this, the worker is made into a protected category like widow, orphan, and stranger. Workers are understood to be poor and deserving of our protection, and the text asserts the need for workers to be protected by specific legislation. After the Torah, there are a wealth of rabbinic texts that outline what the obligations are toward the worker. The Talmud is an ancient compendium of Jewish law and ethics, which was redacted around the year 500. It's the primary source of law for the Jewish canon, together with commentaries that continue up until today. One tractate in particular, Bava Metzia, addresses at length the ethical and legal matters surrounding employment. The Talmud comments, "Whoever withholds the wages of a hired laborer transgresses 5 prohibitions and 1 affirmative precept. Number 1, you shall not oppress your neighbor nor rob him. Number 2, you shall not oppress a hired servant that is poor. Number 3, the wages of the one that is hired shall not remain all night with you. Number 4, at the end of the day you shall give him his wages. And 5, neither shall the sun go down upon it." The Talmud then adds a comment on our verse that we read from Hebrew scriptures, Deuteronomy 24:15, that you must pay out any wages due on the same day before the sun sets, for the worker is needy and his life depends upon it, etc. It adds this very sharp question on the clause, "and his life depends upon it." It says, "Why did this laborer ascend the ladder, suspend himself from the tree, and risk death itself? Was it not that you should pay him his wages?" And in another interpretation, it suggests, and his life depends upon it teaches, the one who withholds an employee's wages is as though he deprived him of his life. So what are the ideas behind the two rabbinic interpretations? First, there seems to be an assumption that a job will be enough to provide an acceptable living to the worker. This idea is strengthened by the Rabbi Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, who was a leading medieval Jewish scholar and biblical commentator of the 13th century. He says, according to the plain meaning of the verse, this rule is clear from what is written elsewhere in Leviticus 19:13. Do not keep the wages of a hired laborer with you until the morning. This teaches that when the Torah says, do not keep his wages with you until morning, the intention is that he should collect the wages on the day that he works. For if he doesn't collect the wages right away as he's leaving work, he will go home, his wages will remain with you until morning, and he will die of hunger that night. We know that our modern experience isn't precisely the same. But while there are certainly some workers living on the edge of starvation, for most American workers, the situation is more complicated. 34 million people, or 10.5% of the nation's population, lived below the official poverty level in 2019, according to the US Census Bureau, and 6.3 million of them were among the working poor in 2019, according to data from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. The working poor are people who spent at least 27 weeks in the labor force, but whose income still fell below the official poverty level. The fact that so many people are unable to support themselves or their families while working full-time, sometimes more than one job, is yet more evidence that something is very wrong in our society. Although our economic and communal structures are different from those of the biblical and the Talmudic eras, it is clear that the human tendency to exploit those seeking work remains unchanged. The message of Jewish tradition is that this is unacceptable. In a commentary called Tosafot, compiled in 189 of the Common Era, the sages inform us, if he is finished plowing by noon, the employer may not say to him, come and pull the weeds in another field. For the worker may say to him, provide me with work in your property, or pay me my wage for the work I've already done. That's from Tosafta of the Baba Metzia. This directly speaks to quiet quitting and other form of employer demands for work beyond what is being paid for. Together with the Talmudic passage we cited earlier, it's clear that not only is the treatment of workers a matter of great moral import, but that the way we pay workers and the demand for working beyond what they are contracted to do is actually not one, but at least three forms of theft. We don't often think of the way we pay employees, underpaying them, asking them to work off the clock, asking them to do more than can be accomplished during their hours, as theft. But the rabbis correctly understood it as such. Indeed, the phrase from our biblical verse, hu nasa et nafsho, can be understood or translated as stealing his life. This is not simply a metaphoric statement. Failing to pay a worker adequately means they cannot provide for the essentials of life, even if it doesn't, as it may have in biblical and Talmudic times, cause him to die of starvation in the night. There is absolutely no doubt that it shortens people's lives to not have sufficient or good quality food and shelter, let alone to be able to pay for healthcare. In addition, it steals their time, and the Jewish tradition also unequivocally requires everyone, from the most powerful person to the animals being used as labor and even the land itself, to rest every week. In America, this has been stolen from many people who simply cannot afford to take even a single day off. It is stealing money from the employee as well, since they are not be paying for work that they are doing. And finally, it is a theft of their dignity as a human being, which treats them as an exploitable resource rather than as a precious human soul, equal in value to the employer. The 18th century Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, author of the great work Mesilat Yesharim, which means the path of the just, wrote, most people are not outright thieves, taking their neighbor's property and putting it in their own premises. However, In their business dealing, most of them get a taste of stealing whenever they permit themselves to make an unfair profit at the expense of someone else, claiming that such a profit has nothing to do with stealing. It is not merely the obvious and explicit theft with which we have to concern ourselves, but any unlawful transfer of wealth from one individual to another that may occur in everyday economic activities. Human beings have a great capacity for lying to ourselves about what we are doing when we oppress others. Most people don't want to steal others' time, money, and really, in the case of labor, their lives. But America has normalized doing so to the extent that we can discuss working only for what we are paid as a form of quitting. We have so normalized oppressing workers that we have done nothing to help those who are not working at multiple jobs and still not able, those who are working at multiple jobs and still not able to gain normal basic necessities. And we blame not the employer who doesn't pay them, but the worker who's not got the power to bargain for fair pay and benefits. It is for this reason that the sages actually asserted that individuals have the right to collective bargaining, what we today call unions. From the era of the earliest commentaries, the rabbis assert that workers of many different kinds have the right to set up minimum wages, work hours, and more. And this has held true up to the modern day. The former chief rabbi of Mandatory Palestine and then of the State of Israel, Rabbi Ben Sion Meir Chai Utziel, in the earliest 20th century, said that our sages recognize that the regulations of craftsmen or of workers' federations, either in the form of a general union or in the form of separate professional ones, in order to protect himself, the worker thus had the right to organize and to enact suitable regulations. The disgrace that we inflict on our fellow citizens throughout this nation is one of the reasons that I have been so involved with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. The Poor People's Campaign is committed to creating a national movement rooted in a moral analysis based on our deepest religious and constitutional values that demand justice for all. A moral revival is necessary to save the heart and soul of our democracy. The U.S. Constitution was established to promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And the Poor People's Campaign demands that given the abundance that exists in this country and the fundamental dignity inherent to all humanity, every person in the United States has the right to dignified jobs, living wages, housing, education, healthcare, welfare, and the right to organize for the realization of these rights. As a movement, part of our work is demanding full employment and the right for all workers to form and join unions, an end to anti-union and anti-workers' rights laws in the states, and equal pay for equal work. People are often quick to forget that the scriptures are not simply a nice collection of stories. They are a legal and political document making moral demands, not only of individuals, but of the entire society, and yes, of nations. And we must not fail to fulfill those demands. Our lives and souls depend upon it. Rav Uziel, whom we mentioned a minute ago, also cited another part of Hebrew scriptures in Deuteronomy 15. He says, how does one establish a relationship of love and honor? He cites the verse about the servant who wants to remain with his master. If after 7 years, an indentured servant does not want to leave because it is good for him or her to be with you, that's Deuteronomy 15, the Talmud says that this is because you treated them as your kin in regard to food and in regard to drink. This teaches that the relationship between the employer and the worker needs to be a relationship of fellowship as with an equal, and not a relationship in which one person is of inferior status. As such a relationship can lead to acts that are insulting or that induce shame. For the employer needs to show toward the employee the same qualities that the employee shows toward the employer. Through this partnership, the work of the society will be completed. We must commit ourselves to changing the way we think about work and workers. Every worker is a nefesh, a soul whose dignity is without limit, and who must be paid in such a way as to be able to live, not only to be able to acquire their basic needs, but to share in the bounty that this country can provide. Remember Rav and Rabba Bar Hanan? Rav told him that even though he had actually lost money because the workers were clumsy, Rabba Bar Hanan was obligated to pay them. He was not permitted to penalize them. And what was the reason? Proverbs 2:20, Laman telech b'derech tovim v'arachot tzadikim tishmor. Follow the way of the good and keep to the paths of the just. If we wish to follow the way of the good and keep to the path of the just, we must commit ourselves as a nation to making sure that workers have a chance at a dignified life. And each of us is responsible for making that happen. Thank you.